patient didn't read the echo report. What this guy doing? He was not supposed to behave like this.
I'm wondering what's happening. Let me just call my friend.
But don't start recording yet, Shibu.
It's okay. I'll forget afterwards.
I'll remind you, because then you'll send the whole recorded thing. I'll remind you. Switch it off.
Anyway. Hi, Vally.
Hi.
Shibu has a railway obsessed friend. Not just railway. I'm not talking about Valentine Lobo. Another friend of his. Probably he also knows Venkat.
Yeah, he's also a classmate of us.
So Venkat is crazy about trains, highways, anything to do with infrastructure.
All infrastructure.
Big bridges.
Okay.
So in our group, he'll keep posting pictures of railway.
But as kids on train trips, our biggest preoccupation used to be to figure out the pattern of the steam engine, because each one had a different front facade, like cars have that grill. So my brother and I used to count how many of them are star engines. The star engine used to have a light in the middle with star all over, and that was the most powerful. And the others were one round. He used to call it Papadam engine, and all kinds of shortcut names to identify different kinds of engines.
Yeah, actually, there are ways of identifying them by the letters which you see on the engine. I'm not going to talk about steam, but I'll explain that with regard to diesel today.
Okay.
Vally, can you put on your video so that we can see you also?
No, the problem is that the camera is shared with I'm getting a message that this camera is shared by two computers with the same IP address or something like that. So yeah, I'm using my office one, so there's some problem.
Okay. All right. Okay. Anyway, let me introduce Vally before we continue. He's my old schoolmate from Pune days. And after that, we met during our 25th reunion. And so from school days, he's now moved on to become a nephrologist and working in Pune. So he's pretty knowledgeable on those aspects. But surprisingly, I found that he's taken up this strange fascination for railways. And he knows a whole lot of things, which is quite amazing and interesting. So I thought it would be good to hear him talk about this. So, am I mute? No. Okay. No. All right. Okay. So over to you, Vally, without any further delay.
Why is Vally's video not on?
Here's some interference with his computer, he said.
Three computers are sharing that.
Yeah. So is my screen visible?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. So thanks, Shibu. And let's hope I can make this interesting. I'm happy to hear that there are other people who were fascinated like me with trains. My fascination started at the same time also in childhood during rail travel. And that was perhaps the only method of travel we had then. So the most fascinating. Right. So I'm not an engineer or a technical expert. As Shibu said, I'm a doctor like him. I have no connection with Indian Railways, except that my grandfather worked in the railways and I was born in the railway hospital in Hubli. And so I acknowledge the Indian Railways Fan Club Association led in Pune by Dr. Sirish Yande, who's a urologist, and all my friends over there. I've used some of their pictures with their permission, but viewpoints were expressed without evidence to back them up are my personal viewpoints, nothing to do with the association or the railways. So what will I be trying to cover today? Naturally, I had to restrict this, make it something more specific. So basics of diesel traction, terminology and nomenclature of the Indian diesel locomotives, some of its history and the special situations, the eternal diesel versus electric debate. And as we know that India is now going to aim for complete electrification by 2022. So what will the future hold for diesel traction then? What are the types of diesel locomotives we have? Basically, the diesel locomotives in India, with one exception, are all what are called diesel electric locomotives. That means it's a large diesel engine which is coupled to an alternator or a generator, and the electric current that is produced by the generator then drives traction motors, and the traction motors turn the wheels. So there are three types. The earliest ones were DC-DC. So the AC current generated by the alternator would be rectified and fed to a DC traction motor. Then we had AC-DC, so AC alternator output being rectified. And today, what is available with the silicon revolution and thyristors, which can handle the three-phase AC very well. We have what is called as AC-DC AC. So AC generated, rectified, and then an inverter reconverts it to three-phase AC for three-phase traction motors, which are more efficient. There was one diesel loco in India, the WDM4, which was a diesel hydraulic, and it was imported from Germany. So the main country in the world which has used diesel hydraulic transmission is the Federal Republic of Germany. But now, like most of Europe, it has gone completely electric. So this is a schematic diagram, and I illustrate some of what I was saying. You have a large diesel engine and you have a fuel tank. So the fuel tank and the diesel engine are the heart of the diesel locomotive. Then there is a main alternator and an auxiliary alternator. The auxiliary alternator drives the other functions that are required, AC, lighting, etc., within the train. And when this is used, it is something known as head-on generation. So there are three types of rakes or coaches in India which are used. The old ICF, Integral Coach Factory, which were Indian manufactured, which carried alternators on the wheels. So when the train ran, the wheels rotating would turn smaller alternators and generate the current for the electricity required for these auxiliary services. Then came what were called the LHB rakes, which can touch higher speeds. You see those red rakes running around with the Rajdhanis. You have the light blue ones on the Shatabdis. So these are the LHB, Link Hoffmann Bosch, a German company which makes these rakes. And these rakes, to make so that the coaches are lighter, do not have alternators coupled to the wheels. So they require what is called as an EOG, end-on generation car. That is, at the each end of the rake, you have an generator cars. And then you have what is head-on generation. So no end-on generation. The generation is done by the loco and transmitted. So you have a drive shaft. You have, as I said, you have the driving cab here. You have rectifiers to convert the AC to DC. And then you have the electronic controls. And today, some of the newest locomotives have entirely microprocessor based controls and thyristors for controlling the three-phase AC. And you have, in addition, so what is the basic principle is you have an air intake. So air is taken in and compressed in either the two-stroke or a four-stroke engine. The air is compressed to the extent where when fuel is injected, there is no spark plug required in this, unlike your car engine or a petrol engine. The compressed air has reached such a high temperature that the fuel ignites immediately, and that drives the next stroke of the diesel engine. So two-stroke or four-stroke. The earlier ones were two-stroke, the WDMs, and now the WDPs are four-stroke engines, some of them. This is a picture of Miraj Junction, where I was in the medical college for a few months in 1989. Now, what you can see is Miraj Junction was unique in the through the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s till early 2000 because it had this large loco on the left-hand side is a broad gauge locomotive. You can see the star, which was mentioned earlier, and the middle one is a meter gauge locomotive and the one on the right is a narrow gauge locomotive. So Miraj Junction had all three gauges in India. There was a line coming to Pune, which was broad gauge. There was a line going to Kolhapur on the other side, which was broad gauge. The line which left Miraj for Hubli and Bangalore was a meter gauge line, and the Barshi Light Railway, which ran to Latur, was a narrow gauge line. Now, what these steam engines you can see with them is they have a boiler, they have a tender, and they have a cab in between, and they can only run in one direction. So something that was there in the Miraj yard at that stage was a turntable. At the end of a train completing its journey and entering Miraj Junction, this engine had to be turned around on a turntable and run in the opposite direction when it took the train back. So one of the advantages of diesel was that there was no need to turn the engine around, the locomotive around. It could run in either direction. It also could operate for very long periods, up to 3,200 kilometers or more before requiring a maintenance, unlike steam engines which required maintenance after a few hours of operation. So you could imagine a train that would run from Guwahati to Ahmedabad if necessary, and then it would require some maintenance, and then it would be immediately ready to run the return journey. It was less fuel required than a steam locomotive, 4 times more efficient. It could accelerate a train much more rapidly, and it would operate at higher sustained speeds with less damage to the track. And most importantly, the diesel electric locomotive would carry its own power plant with it. So that was one of the advantages over electrification. So the electrification requires an overhead or a third rail to supply the electricity from the grid. So a large distribution system and feed wires. And if you are using DC as was used out of Mumbai until 2009, then a lot of substations were required to transmit DC. Now the entire country is on 25 kilovolts AC. So I said, when you look at a locomotive, and you can see this locomotive here, it has some markings on it. At the right hand bottom corner, you will see that it says WDM3A, and on the left hand side, there is a number. So what do these mean? The first letter in that, W, stands for broad gauge or wide gauge. In India, this broad gauge is 1.676 meters. And this is peculiar to India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. When you go to European countries, or for that matter, even to Sri Lanka, what they call is the standard gauge, which is 1.4315. So Indian locomotives essentially had to be built specially for India for Western by locomotive manufacturers until the Chitrandan loco works in India, and then the diesel loco works in Varanasi, and the diesel modification work in Patiala took over completely the building of locomotives because of this gauge. If the now first letter was Y, then that would mean meter gauge. If the first letter was Z, it would mean narrow gauge. And there is one more which I will show you, and that is N, which stood for narrower gauge. So the narrow gauge is 0.76 meters, and the narrower gauge was 0.6 meters, and is exclusively run on the hill railways of India. The Ooty Railway, the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway, the Neral Mataran Railway, and the Kalka Simla Railway. So these are the 4 hill railways which use the narrowest gauge of all and the lightest locomotives and rakes to climb. The second letter indicates the type of power. D stands for diesel. C stands for DC electric overhead. Now, these locomotives are completely obsolete, but at one time, all power running out of Mumbai was DC 1500 volts overhead. A stands for AC electric overhead. CA, this was the group of locomotives which were specially designed when the rest of the country became AC 25 kilovolts, but the locomotives running out of Mumbai, the lines running out of Mumbai were DC. So the CA class of locomotives could take both DC and AC with 2 different pantographs. And there was a neutral section. The neutral section running out on Western Railway was at Danu Road, where there was an unpowered section where the locomotive would lower one pantograph and raise the other to switch from DC to AC power. B stood for battery. The third letter stands for the type of haulage. G would mean that it was a freight locomotive or goods, P for passenger, M for mixed, S for shunters, U for multiple units, and R for a rail car. The Kalka Shimla has a rail car, and in Gujarat, Nadiad to Kapadwanj, there is a rail car on broad gauge. So summarizing that, you have gauge, the power, the load, the class, and finally there could be in some one more letter seen after that. You can see that this is WDM3A. So the number which you see over there stands for the power rating. In the case of diesels, it was the number into 1000 gave you the horsepower of the locomotive. So a WDM3 would be 3000 horsepower. And then if there was an additional buildup of power, then 3A meant 3100 horsepower. WDM3D would be 3400 horsepower, etc. But this is only true for diesel locomotives. For the electric, it stood for some modifications which had been made, and also for certain diesels, as I'll show you. In addition to that, what you have is now this locomotive, what you can see is it says Kalyan over here, and it says Central Railway. So additionally, you also have a road number. The road number on this, I can recognize this. If a true rail fan or a train spotter, if he saw 21937 until August this year, would know that this train is the Deccan Queen even without seeing anything else. The Deccan Queen had a dedicated, and this is a WCA M3 locomotive which hauled the Deccan Queen for many years from the late 1990s till this early this year, when it has been replaced by a complete ACWAP7 locomotive. So if I saw this locomotive even head on, I would know that the train it was hauling was the Deccan Queen. As you can see over here, this would tell me it's the Deccan Queen. Here you can see a road number which is also displayed prominently on the side, and most locomotives, according to their road number, it's an arbitrary number from a pool that is assigned by the railway authorities, but locomotive with a particular road number would also tell you which shed it belonged to. So 17904 belongs to Pune shed. And you can see here, so even if I didn't see this Pune written at the front, if I saw the number from the side, I would know, if I was aware, that this locomotive is coming from Pune shed. Yeah. If the letter R was attached to the number further, then that would say that this was a locomotive which had initially been built as one class and then remodified to another class of locomotive. So R meant that it had been rebuilt, and this is from Ahmedabad Vatwa shed. In addition, the colors of the locomotives could often give a clue to the shed from where they came. So this orange with a cream band across it is typical of Ernakulam Junction shed. This is Ratlam shed with orange, white and blue, and this is the WDP which powers the Trivandrum Rajdhani, and this is known as the livery of the Golden Rock Trichy shed. So the livery, the color of a locomotive could also give the indication of which shed it belonged to and where it was stabled and maintained. Why the freight versus passenger locomotives and mixed locomotives? What is different between a locomotive which hauls goods and one which hauls passenger traffic? So express trains, that is passenger trains, need speed, while freight trains need pulling power. The loads in freights are several hundred times that of the passenger locomotives, of the passenger trains. So goods locomotives need to have more starting traction or torque to produce to pick up a load from standstill and get it moving, whereas that comes at the cost of speed. The locomotives have to be heavier and they have to have lower gear ratios to deliver more torque at the wheelbase, rather than a passenger locomotive which requires to be lighter and have higher gear ratios to achieve higher speeds. Freight locomotives can haul passenger trains, but not vice versa. And the mixed locomotives do a bit of both, making them both good and bad at either of these. So this is a comparison of some of the locos which you can see. You can see the WDG, so that's a goods locomotive, 300 horsepower, and the WDP3A is the Trivandrum Rajdhani's passenger locomotive. Both have the same horsepower. This is the weight, and this is the axle load. So the WDP3 has a lower axle load. The adhesion factor is not known for this, but the adhesion factor is high for goods trains, and it has a maximum speed rating at 105, whereas the passenger loco is rated at the same power for 160 kilometers an hour. Similarly, what you can see is for two goods locomotives here, a goods locomotive and a passenger locomotive in the electric class, same power, gear ratios are different, weight is the same, axle ratio is the same, but the goods loco is rated at 100 kph and the passenger one at 140. This is very briefly, and I'm not going to go into all the details, just to talk about a few points, the history of diesel locomotive traction in India. The first one ever to be built or to be imported was the WDM1, and it is now out of service. The WDM1 was imported from the American Locomotive Company, and all the locomotives subsequently, until the EMD came into the picture, were modifications of the basic ALCO, as they were called, and they were known to us all as ALCOs. Now, the WDM1 was imported. The WDM2, the quintessential and the most successful locomotive in Indian Railways, was built initially by ALCO, but then later the technology was transferred to the diesel loco works at Varanasi, and they were indigenously built. And subsequently, most of the ALCOs were all indigenously built. Only the WDM3 came from Henschel. This was a diesel hydraulic and it came from Henschel in Germany. It was not very successful. Only 8 were imported. It had a top speed of 120 and it was quickly decommissioned. But WDM2, 9 still in service out of 2,700 which were totally used, and most of the others are still in service. So the WDM class, the most basic locomotives, they were the most popular. In fact, if one looks at thinks about diesel locomotives until a few years ago, essentially what we would think of was those WDM2s. They were seen all over the country, and they were all basically from the American Locomotive Company based on the WDM2. Later models were rebuilt to crank some more power out of them. So a little bit of a modification. The basic had 2,600 horsepower. They pushed it up to a maximum of about 3,400 horsepower. They were rugged, they were very reliable and powerful. They were very simple, easy to operate, and engineers were able to, in India, produce different versions, including increasing the cylinders from 12 to 16 and eventually to 20. This is the WDM1, and probably that was still we were suffering from an overdose of steam. So it had a driving cab at one end. So this locomotive still needed a turntable to get it around when it had to reverse direction. And then came, this is Guntakal railway station, and here you can see this is a typical scene from the 1980s or 1990s, where you would see these ubiquitous WDM2s all over. They would haul passenger traffic and they would also haul goods traffic. Right. So here is a WDM2 hauling goods traffic. Some group of WDM2s were built like this way with a short forward hood below the cab, and this group, somebody thought fancifully that it resembled an elephant. So they were called the WDM2 jumbos. So a few of them still in existence, but overall the WDM2s, though being the most successful, have seen the end of their days. Now, this was one of the engineering marvels of Indian Railways. What they did was to rebuild the WDM2 as something called the WDM2G. The WDM2, as I told you, had a horsepower of 2,600 from a single diesel engine. Now, what they did was to rebuild it having three 800 horsepower engines, so that when it was hauling lighter loads or shunting or running light, it did not have to consume that much of fuel or generate that much power. So this locomotive could run at anything between 800 to 2,600 horsepower, depending on the load it was required to pull. This is a meter gauge locomotive. You can see YDM4 and a number which is only 4 digits. So this is a YDM4, which is a meter gauge diesel locomotive. These locomotives, now that most of the gauge conversion has taken place, I think the only line which is still running meter gauge is Akola Mau Ratlam, which uses these YDM4 locomotives. And this is the WDM to a 3D. So the first WDM locomotive at 3,400 horsepower to haul in 1969, when Indian Railways was really looking to improve the speeds at which trains ran. This was the first locomotive to pull the Howrah-Delhi Rajdhani, and till the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Howrah-Delhi and even for some time the Delhi-Mumbai Rajdhani would be hauled by this. The WDM 3D had 3,400 horsepower and could haul an 18 coach rake at 120 to 130 kilometers an hour, whereas the WDM2 had to be coupled. So two WDM2s would be used to pull the Delhi Mumbai Rajdhani up to Ratlam and Baroda, and then from Baroda onwards, it would get electric traction to Mumbai. So this is the Bangalore Rajdhani, which I photographed some years ago, and it's being hauled by a WDM4. This was the ICF Rajdhani coaches before they were all replaced by LHB coaches and the WDM4. This was the Bangalore Rajdhani would travel from Manmad to Bangalore under diesel and from Manmad to Delhi with electric until the Guntakal link became electrified, and so on. Now a WAP7 takes it all the way from Bangalore to Delhi. So this is the prestigious Karnataka Express, another train which until I think about 3 or 4 years ago was diesel all the way from Bangalore to Karnataka, and it would get twin WDM2 or twin WDM3 locos. Usually it got a WDM3A with a WDM3D to haul it all the way. So then came the dedicated, so these were all mixed traction up to WDM7, which was exclusively now reserved for shunting and are located at Ernakulam shed. Then came the dedicated passenger locomotives, the WDPs, and this was the railway's attempt to really go big time for high speed locomotives, though they are now also going to replace these with electric. So the WDP1 was not very successful. They built about 69 of them, just 2,300 horsepower, and they are now stabled. A few of the remaining ones are located at Tughlakabad shed in Delhi. The WDPA was the one which hauled the Trivandrum Rajdhani at 3,100 horsepower. It could touch a top speed of 160, as could the WDP4. Now, the WDP4 was also used in when the Spanish Talgo train rake was used on trials in India when the railways were considering acquiring it, and the WDP4 then touched a speed of 185 kilometers an hour with the Talgo rake. And there have been several other modifications. And then you have the dedicated goods locos, WDG3A to WDG4, which is the most successful. What were the features? Now, these locomotives came, unlike the earlier ones which came from Alco, these came from General Motors and the or from electromotive diesel. And electromotive diesel were in the race initially to produce locomotives in India, but they were not willing to transfer the technology. So it was not until the late 1980s or early 1990s that they agreed to do that, and that was when these dedicated GM EMD locomotives came to India. What was the difference? Microprocessor control was introduced. So wheel slip, a mechanism by which the track condition and the optimum wheel adhesion and tractive effort required could be obtained by feedback and processed to determine exactly what power should be delivered to axles was a feature of the EMD locomotives. They had larger fuel tanks. They had fiberglass cabins, making them lighter for the same power. They also had the cabs were air conditioned and contained a washroom. So there was a whole lot of modifications which also made the life of the loco pilots easier. This is a WDM7. This is Tughlakabad sheds, TKD. You can see Tughlakabad sheds WDP1. This is the Tejas Express, the prestigious Tejas group of trains which was started. And this is on the Konkan Railway, where a WDP3A still hauls it. In addition to, it sometimes takes care of the Trivandrum Rajdhani. This is the WDP4, specifically the one which drives one of, there are only two Shatabdis at present which are totally diesel hauled. And this is the loco which hauls the New Jalpaiguri Howrah Shatabdi. I did read a few days ago that now it has recently been converted to electric. The other Shatabdi, which is totally diesel hauled and which is the fastest Shatabdi, is the Pune Secunderabad one. So this is one of the problems which was seen with the WDP4. The WDP4's cab, you can see, is here. So it could run in what was called short hood forward, where the cab was in front, or long hood forward, which is where it's the way it's running here. When in long hood forward, visibility was poor because of this peculiar house-shaped front that it had in this mode. And this is the WDG3A. They were also called Shakti. And here, this is a Kalyan-based one moving on to Konkan Railway. This is a meter gauge WDM4. I think I showed this earlier. So in addition to the dedicated goods locos, and the most successful goods locos were the WDG4, the WDG5, which is just coming into trials. It's called Bhim. And about a month ago, Indian Railways released out the WDG6, which is the highest powered diesel traction available at 6,000 horsepower. It is equal to the electric locomotives, but let's see how it does as it's used out. If the word S, if the letter S appears, then we know that these are shunters. So this is the WDG4. This is the WDG4. I mentioned about poor visibility. So the modification in the WDG4D was to provide a cab at either end so the locomotive could run and visibility was improved. This is the WDG6. This is WG6. This is a shunter. We've all seen those. So small locomotives, WDS, it's a shunter, very low powered, about 1300 horsepower, only required for shunting. Meter gauge, and then these lovely narrow gauge Z and N class locomotives. So this is a meter gauge from Sabarmati in Ahmedabad, Sabarmati shed. Ahmedabad has now also moved almost totally to broad gauge, but at the time when I was there 20 years ago, Ahmedabad had meter gauge and broad gauge operating out of it. This is from Hubli shed, YDM4, Sabarmati shed, and this is the Miraj Latur passenger. Tiny little train, it would pick up speed extremely slowly. You could run alongside it and get onto it. And this was a ZDM class locomotive. It would haul a train that was not more than 5 coaches long. The ZDMs also hauled the famous Shakuntala Express. Now, the Shakuntala Express was the only railway line. It was between Yavatmal and Achalapur in Maharashtra, which was not owned by the Indian Railways. It was owned by a Liverpool-based company, Killick Nielsen, until 2016. So 70 years after independence, the Indian Railways operated this line with their rolling stock and locomotives, but paid for the line they paid royalties for the line to the Killick Nielsen company. And this was the lifeblood of people in interior Maharashtra. It took 8 hours to cover the 190-kilometer run, but there you can see. The Shakuntala Express is a tiny 4-coach rake, and you can see it over here on a bridge, and here you can see it leaving Achalapur station. So the about in 2016, the railways decided that this line would be converted to broad gauge. Unfortunately, they worked on it up to Murtizapur junction, but after that, it appears that since 2017, this track has been left to rust. The NDMs were the hill railways, and several of these have become World Heritage Sites. This is the Neral Mataran rail train leaving Neral station with an NDM 1A. So just 2 feet broad were the hill rod, or narrower gauge at 60 centimeters is the NDM class. This is another, the Mataran Queen, a rail car which used to take the same route, and this is the Kalka Simla rail car, which also is at a 30-inch gauge or 60 centimeters. So I come to the diesel versus electric debate. The diesel engine was invented by Rudolf Diesel towards the end of the 19th century, and the first electric railway in Europe was actually run 12 years earlier. The first diesel locomotive was to run was in actually somewhere around 1938. So it was a real late starter. And for the same way, electric diesel traction has a slightly higher capacity. The highest diesel traction was about 240 kilometers an hour by Britain's Intercity 125, but most of these are slow. And we know that electric trains, the TGV, the Japanese trains, etc., now are capable of touching well over 400 kilometers an hour. But speed is dependent not only on the type of traction, but on numerous other factors, especially the track. Electric traction is perceived as more energy efficient, but this is when we are talking only of transmission from the overhead wire. Finally, India consumes 2% of the world's oil, and the railways uses only 1% of India's oil consumption. So every diesel locomotive of 400,000 horsepower put online, because of the generation that can be achieved by the alternators, adds the power generation capacity of the country by 3 million watts. And every electric locomotive of 6,000 horsepower eats into the power generation by 4 to 5 million watts. 14 or 15% of villages are yet to be electrified. I think that's come down now in the last couple of years. So can we afford totally electrify the railways? Biodiesel could help out. It improves upon emissions, it reduces cost, and it may contribute to environment protection. Now, certainly, if you saw something like this, a smoking alco leaving Pune station, you would get into the idea that yes, alcos are extremely, and diesel is extremely polluting as compared to this pristine WCM3 running up across next to the Indrani River in Kamshet. There's no pollution there. But we need to remember, where does the electricity come from? The electricity power comes either from diesel-based power stations, or even worse, from coal-based power stations. And India's main source of electricity is still thermal. And their greenhouse emission is 26% more than that of a diesel loco. One electric loco requires 4.2 million watts of power, consumes 1 million watt of power, consumes 10 tons of coal per day, and at 40% ash content generates 4 tons of coal ash per day. You would be aware that very recently people have taken to the streets in Goa protesting the doubling of the Vasco to Gadag line from Goa, because they are worried about the transport of coal, which is generating and which is dispersing coal ash across Goa and destroying its environment. When it comes to loco costs, certainly the overhead costs of the locos for electric are higher, but it's said to be balanced out in the long run by lesser fuel costs. Just look at the efficiency of contemporary locos. The WAG5 is an electric locomotive of 4,000 horsepower. The WDG3A is a diesel at 3,100. The starting tractive effort, however, of the WDG3A, because of its adhesion, which is higher, and its gear ratio is actually higher. And if you look at what sort of a load it can start on a different gradient, it can pull and start a higher load on any gradient. Similarly, if you compare the WDG4, which is a diesel, to a WAG9, which is a more powerful electric locomotive, the tractive effort is actually higher for the WDG4, and it can start a bigger load on the same gradient than its electric comparator. So in spite of this, we know that the railways are going forward with electrification. And what are they therefore going to do with that large fleet of diesel locos? Some of them, the diesel loco works in Varanasi, have converted some of the older diesel locos to electric. And two of these are diesel locomotives. These have been converted to what is called as WAG3C, which is a diesel locomotive which has been converted to electric. The base, the wheels, and the traction motors are taken from the WDG3, and the back portion is taken from, and the cab is taken from an electric locomotive, the WAM4. The electric power unit is taken from the WM4. They will be multiple united, and they are rated therefore at 4,400 to 5,000 horsepower, and only one control unit. This is what it looks like. You can see the typical Alco look of the front and the base. You can see the pantograph here, which is taken from the WAM4. Now, these locomotives too were built and put into service, but the railways has had a rethink once again on this, because what they found is the average life of a diesel locomotive is around 18 years. So if the locomotive is going to be refurbished in this way as an electric and add 5 to 6 years of life, it may not be worthwhile. Rather, it may be better. The other options are that they have suggested is selling these to neighboring countries. The problem being, as I said, that with the exception of Bangladesh and Pakistan, the gauges are different, or to auction off the parts. Last of all, this is what the Indian Railways has come up with. This has been introduced on the 23rd of January this year, the first dual mode locomotive. This will have both diesel power and AC electric power. The WDP4D has been modified from a diesel electric to a dual mode. There is a dual cab, 4,500 horsepower in diesel mode, 5,000 horsepower in electric mode. In order to take care of the additional electric equipment, the fuel tank capacity has been reduced from 6,000 liters to 3,000 liters, and it has one pantograph with a selector switch. The idea being that when lines are not end-to-end electrified, then changing of the loco in the middle of the route actually resulted in trains taking more time than if they were run completely diesel. So this problem has been taken care of by this locomotive, which can run dually. It will run on diesel traction and non-electrified sections, and where the electrification is available, it will take. For instance, a train traveling between Mumbai and Secunderabad would run from Mumbai to down with electric traction, would switch to diesel between Down and Wadi, and then move back to electric from Wadi to Secunderabad. So in summary, diesel locomotive traction, it ushered in high speed, flexible, low maintenance freight and passenger traffic in India. The technology has fortunately continued to grow, but it's largely indigenous production and operation now. There is a controversy about environment friendliness, and because of the large electrification push of the railways, the future will probably see complementary operations of both. Thank you all for a patient hearing.
Wow, Vally, very nice, very nice. I mean, you've given me so much new information about a whole lot of stuff. So that's really wonderful.
I have one question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
The British built our railways when they came here, and why did they choose 3 countries to have a wider broad gauge? I mean, instead of using the standard thing that they were using world over.
That they were using the world over, including in their own country, is something that I have not been able to figure out. The only answer I can get is that they wanted to ensure they had a market even when they left. One of the reasons that has been quoted by some of their contemporary writings was that they felt that it would be more stable in India, and that they would require, seeing the size and the population of the country, that the larger the better was what they felt.
Okay.
The reason, Prasad, is perhaps they had it in the UK and they wanted a permanent market
Yeah,
in India.
Yeah, that's what I
that probably
said.
explains this,
Shibu,
because they knew the size of the market, and that was
Yeah.
a sort of
Yeah.
assured future
Yeah.
demand.
In
Shibu,
fact,
may
when
I
they
make a comment? Shibu, may I
Yeah,
make
yeah,
a
please, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Lobo, for somebody who's a non-engineer to take so much interest in this subject, which is a very, very specialized subject, is truly amazing.
Amazing.
It actually absolutely a fantastic presentation, and I enjoyed thoroughly every minute of it.
Thank you, sir.
I have 2 questions to ask you. One is, have you done a similar work on steam engines? Because steam engines have a very
Yes.
colorful history.
Uh,
If you have done a similar work on steam, maybe one day we could hear it. It's a very fascinating story. That is number one.
Certainly, sir.
Number two is, there is a view which you hold, and I may be wrong, and I am not sure whether I'm correct or not, that in transportation we must use only electricity, because oil is limited in the world. It is exhaustible, and you must use oil where electricity cannot be used. There are some applications in the world where oil is a must, which cannot be replaced by electricity. Whereas there are applications like transport, car, and railway movement and so on, where electricity over time not only can become the only alternative, but it also be cheaper. That's a view that I hold. But do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I agree with you, sir. Overall, that certainly oil is not going to last forever, and oil alternatives to oil must be found. The problem that exists at the moment is that while we were planning for electrification of the railways, the production of cars, trucks was increasing. So it was a little bit of a discrepancy there. So now, in
We
the last
lost you.
couple of, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Yeah. So in the last couple of years, what has happened is that yes, even cars, there is a push towards electrically driven cars. So I think that same consciousness is becoming overall it's widening. So certainly oil should be conserved where possible. Unfortunately, if it's going to happen at the cost of using more coal, then the environment is going to suffer in the process. And coal is also a fossil fuel which isn't going to last forever. If India does get into nuclear power generation for nuclear power for electricity generation, then yes, there would be a definite improvement.
Yeah, I know, I agree with you. The coal, I'm not substituting oil with coal. We should substitute oil with wind and sun and all those which are available in nature already. So,
Yeah,
but it's an
absolutely.
excellent presentation, Lobo.
Thank you,
Mr.
sir.
Lobo, I am
Sure.
Lakshminarayan here. It's very interesting. You've just taken me back to 1971 because Tata's to a collaboration with a company called Henschel.
Henschel.
And Henschel was the one that you showed here, which is the one that made diesel hydraulic.
Yes, sir.
The idea was that the entire torque converter, which was being used as the hydraulic, which is the hydraulic torque converter, was replacing the mechanical flywheel, which was storing the energy and which was transmitting on a regular basis. I had the pleasure of working, my first job as a graduate trainee was I worked with a gentleman by name Sach, who actually designed the first locomotive by Henschel for the German railways. And as you can clearly see, he used to have all the drawings which were somewhere in 1941 during Hitler's time. But I think it's very interesting to see the entire presentation. Just to say that we finally did work continuously with RDSO. And that's why I was just looking at the presentation. I used to work with a company called Bosch. And we used to work with RDSO regularly. And I used to have number of meetings with RDSO, especially when the General Motors came in with their engines to find out as to how we could electrify, how we could control the whole thing electronically by means of electric ECU, the electronic control unit. And we had almost got 12 of those engines ready. But unfortunately, some babu in the railway ministry suddenly felt, no, this does not work because the ECU sensor or whatever, ECU was giving the real quality for the pollution. It was really coming down to what you call at the stage 6. And now I'm talking about something like about 15 years ago. It's a very interesting journey. Thank you very much. I lived through it, and
I forgot to mention RDSO. They have done fantastic work overall in this.
Yeah.
Mr. Lobo, if you ever take interest in steam engines,
yes, sir,
I would like to provide you with some information.
One of the
earliest steam engines of India, may not be the earliest, in 1907 steam engine, we have in our possession in Jamshedpur in our museum.
Okay. Yeah. That would be fascinating.
Okay. 1907.
Yeah. Yeah. The reunion mail, there's an steam engine put up outside the Pune station, which is 1902, the reunion mail. In fact, it was a struggle. At one stage, the railways wanted to break it down to scrap and sell it. And being a heritage, there was a huge movement here in Pune saying, no, it must be preserved. And eventually, fortunately, that did happen.
Very good.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Vally. That was fantastic. Really loved it.
Valentine has landed up in a whole bunch of IIT engineers. You can see how keen they were all.
I can say is,
do you do anything of nephrology?
In his spare time.
He's a great nephrologist too.
I think India has gained a great nephrologist, but lost a fantastic IRSC officer.
Exactly.
Anyway, so Vally, do stay on for our next talk by Prasad.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do we have time, Shibu? We'll take about 25 minutes at least.
How about the others?
We're already
we might. Yeah.
I'm happy. I'm looking forward to hearing Prasad also.
Okay. Let's hear it.
Let's see. I'll try and cut it here and there, but otherwise we'll just extend it a bit. Okay, I'm going to share screen. You see my screen?
Yes.
I'm going to move one slide because last time when I shared screen, it didn't move. Is this moving?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the subject of what I wanted to talk about today. And actually, I realized that the roots of this issue in my head actually began sometime when I must have been interacting with my creative director in the advertising business. So in the advertising business, the advertising films we make are...
Can you make it full screen? Thanks.
Okay. So the advertising business, we are constantly trying to make films and tell stories, much like the feature films that we all see. And the most common gripe that I heard from the creative writer who had to write these scripts, and he used to say it's so much tougher to tell the story in 30 seconds. But that was the worldwide standard format for a TV film. And he said, maybe I will get into writing feature films. It must be much simpler. So I've heard this so often. And as I look at this sort of concept of a micro fiction and micro stories, I thought that maybe this is where it all started in my head. Well, given my advertising background, don't accuse me of creating an ad here. Though this looks like an ad, folklore says that this is credited to Ernest Hemingway for the shortest novel he ever wrote. 6 words. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. And the folklore goes that Ernest Hemingway was with 4 other writers in a bar drinking beer. They got into an argument, and he challenged everybody to write a story in a very short form. And he said he would win. And sure enough, with these 6 words, he won. Of course, the veracity of this folklore is not established, because it could well have come from some future classified ad. But it at least makes the point that I wanted to begin making in today's presentation, which is, when you look at this and you ask yourself, were those shoes not used because they were the wrong color? Were they the wrong size? Are they being rejected for poor quality? Or is it a fickle, fashion-conscious mother? Or, wait a minute, is it a tragic loss of a baby that did not survive? So you can clearly see how with just those words, you have left many things for us, the reader, to start imagining things. So maybe if it was spelled out in black and white, our imagination skills may not have been called into play. So if you were to imagine painting a landscape with only 3 colors, suppose I told you don't have the option of all those many colors with which we paint, with artists paint pictures. And if we were told that with just 3 colors, you have to use a combination to evoke the emotion and engagement that a painting can give you. Imagine doing that, and if you are even reasonably attempted some sort of painting in life, you will know how tough that is. Well, I would say microfiction is the literary equivalent of painting with 3 colors. That what you do with paint, you're going to do here with words, with many constraints put on you, and yet the end expectation of what you turn out is not going to be very different. I'm going to call it flash fiction. Flash fiction, which has much been defined all over compared to the normal large storybooks or novels that you read, quite popularly defined as up to 1,000 words. Microfiction today is loosely defined as up to 300 words. But I'm going to deal with, in the rest of the presentation, those of up to even lower, 100 words. And maybe towards the end, maybe even less, something like what Shibu put up in the description of the talk today, which is a one-liner. That too would qualify as a good nanofiction, provided it was not just a clever line, but it attempted to do something that we set out to do. So in many ways, microfiction starts with the same basics. It needs a beginning, it needs a sort of middle, and it needs an end. So it doesn't skip these essential story elements. So the way to judge a good microfiction piece is whether it's just wordplay that the author has attempted, or is he seriously trying to do what most storytellers do. So it just basically, while it doesn't skip these elements, it strips them down to a bare minimum with evocative language. Now, evocative language is a double-edged sword. Here is a constraint on the total length and the total number of words. So you can't do a Shashi Tharoor on writing a novel. You better watch whether you're using any extra word. The main factor in writing microfiction, from the many that I keep reading, is coming up with simpler ideas, fewer characters, fewer events, and less elaborate word building, which would make sure that you stay within what you set out to do. Now, that's not easy, because when the whole thing, the whole piece of up to 100 odd words is the length of an opening paragraph in traditional fiction, which can go on to pages after pages. And therefore, you're asking somebody that what that author did in one paragraph to introduce the setting of his entire novel is the beginning and end of your whole piece. So with well-chosen words, the writer paints emotion. He paints suspense, foreboding, sometimes creating a sense of anxiety, sometimes joy. So every which emotion that we can get from any piece of writing is possible in microfiction. And we'll see some examples as we go down, which can engage the reader's imagination. We, the reader and the writer, are in this together for a very short but very intense ride. And that experience is really where we're going to sort of score and judge whether we have been successful in taking the reader along for an intense ride. And with microfiction, you will find as you read more and more, and I will point you to a few, there are many countless ones available on the internet now. The ending is often in the imagination of the reader. And that is really what stoked my content title. So it's not in the words of the story. And it really takes me back to some of the, many of you would have done the thematic aptitude tests in psychology, where you're shown a picture and you're supposed to write words to describe what the picture, you're supposed to tell a story. We would have all done it in our college or in our psychoanalytic tests. And it's amazing how 4 people sitting in front of the picture would write 4 completely different stories with completely different emotions. So in many ways, it was again the imagination of the reader, in this case, only with words and no picture, but the ending is therefore created by the reader in his or her imagination and not explicitly spelled out. Now, obviously, in such a sort of challenging situation, you need an opening hook. The opening hook, the purpose is to motivate the audience to get through the story. So it must feel compelling. At the very least, it must raise a little interest or curiosity. So you will find a lot of microfiction, either the title or the first line sort of literally grabs you to say, just read on, it's not too long. You don't have to put aside time to read this novel. The dramatic turning point is another characteristic. Micro stories don't always have a climax. As I said, in many cases, the thought completion has to be done by the reader. And that's what is the fun part of reading a micro story, because somebody hasn't spelt it out for you. But the dramatic turning point is an important occurrence that changes the course of events and leads to the ending, which at times may not be defined by the author, may be left to you. And then the resolution, which settles everything once and for all. You could call it the ending, but in many cases, you will find brevity forces the writer to invite the reader to engage in your thought process by leaving a lot of intriguing gaps. Short and sweet stories make us think and imagine the spaces between and around the written word. And with this sort of framework in your head, if you examine the next micro story you read, you will find where the author has sort of left some things for you to create. He may be thinking of the same thing, but he believes that what he's written there allows you to think and create that. Now, here's one I'm going to read, which is written by Dan Cohen. Read with me. As a boy fishes along a mountain stream, he comes across what he first thinks is an animal, but turns out to be a man on all fours, face immersed. When the boy asks what he's doing, he says he's drinking the top of the stream, the sweet part where it meets the air. He leaves the layer below, which tastes of fish and mud, for others. The boy points out that once he has drunk the top, the surface of whatever remains is now the top. The old man laughs. The boy knows nothing about streams. The writer comments that sweating out those last 5 or 6 words felt at times like I was solving a crossword. So you can imagine the skill that the writer has brought into turning out this piece, and all the related questions and views and issues that emerge in your mind. We can do a separate debate for want of time. I just want to go through a few more, one more or two more. This is another microfiction written by Kerry Black. It's called The Serpent's Kiss. Wesley's fit app screeched concern over his elevated heart rate. Muffling didn't stop it, and though he tugged, its clasp held. He slammed his wrist against a stone until it silenced. Darkness embraced him as he scrambled deeper into the tunnel. A woman sang into his hiding place. "You're being silly. Are you a man or a rabbit?" Her footfalls crunched dried leaves. He wriggled against stone, held his breath, and squeezed his eyes shut. The leathery feel of her kiss lingered, dry as a corpse, deadly as the viper she revealed within. He trembled. "I am no rabbit, but you're a snake." And for closer home, here is one by an Indian author, which is again very interesting. It's a little longer, but read with me. "Bhaiya, you have to drop me off first," were the first words which fell on my ears as I got into the Uber, which I had booked to return home that monsoon evening. I looked at the girl sitting beside me, obviously in a shared Uber, barking orders at the Uber driver. I looked at the Uber driver. He was a man of about my father's age. He was struggling to get used to the Google Maps app. The girl sighed, mumbled something, and said, "Left, then right." I sat back and watched it all. The girl seemed way too frustrated with the cab driver. The driver, in turn, was way too nervous. She got down at her location. The driver looked at her and said, "Sorry, ma'am. Learn to use Google Maps. What good are you as a driver otherwise?" she said, and walked away. The driver wiped the corner of his eye with his finger, smiled, and asked me, "Where do I drop you, ma'am?" I guided him to my location. "Thank you," I said, and walked away. I found my phone and dialed my father's number. Remember, she had felt that the driver was like her father. 2 rings later, I heard a "Hello, beta" on the other end. "Papa, I'll teach you how to use Google Maps. I'll teach you how to use any other app which you are unable to use too. You don't have to worry. You'll be way better at it than I am. I love you, Papa," I said in a single go. "Haha, sure, beta. First tell me, who had a problem with Google Maps today?" he said. I smiled. Google Maps would show that he is approximately 1,000 kilometers away from where I am. My heart says that he is somewhere much closer to me always. So those were examples, one Indian and 2 others, which seemed to exemplify some of the things that we spoke of. I'm moving quickly to a category called nano fiction and to something that's closer home. These are websites or apps which are being sort of ventures which have been curated by Indian youngsters. Anuj and Chintan have created this wonderfully, globally become famous, Terribly Tiny Tales. It's an excellent site. And I think for a country which boasts of the highest WhatsApp population and huge usage of SMS, it's only right that Indian entrepreneurs created this ahead of many others in the world. So Terribly Tiny Tales is a very, very interesting site. Do visit it sometime. Anonymous Writer is another one set up by Abhijit Chakravarti, and Scribbled Stories. These are all in the nano fiction area. And I'm just going to give you some examples of this nano fiction. All of the things that I said earlier about microfiction, about imagining the end or trying to read the immense possibilities of what is the author saying, including the interest and engagement to read it, even if it's just a few lines, sometimes tells you the power of it. And then at the end of it, I want to pose 1 or 2 questions to the group. I know that my parents' murderer had a gold tooth. For over a year, my uncle and I grieved. My uncle never smiles now. He's pregnant with possibilities. Is he lost his smile and his laughter because his brother and sister-in-law died? Or he doesn't want to show off his gold tooth? I don't know. Write B for ball, the teacher dictated. A 5-year-old chose to write butterfly instead. A rebel was born. As a teen, I'd always liked the red of a heart. Now it only corrodes the parting of my hair. Note the use of the word corrodes. You can guess or you can start imagining her attitude to conventional recognition of marriage, bindi, sindoor, etc., etc. And maybe 5 people in this room will have 5 different interpretations of what that could mean. I drowned him in the frozen lake, but I hear him scratching the ice inside the freezer of every new fridge I have bought since. The guilt remains. It's tearing his inners. Trying to break open a locker, I hear knocks from the inside. I flee empty-handed. Reaching outside, I hear the knocks from inside me. Fear. With tears in her eyes, she pushed the needle through the cloth. The lipstick stain on his shirt pushed another one through her heart. So those were examples of nanofiction. And I think the key question that I wanted to pose, 1 minute, let me go back to stop share screen share. How do I have to stop here, correct? Okay, can you all, screen share is off?
Yes,
okay,
yes.
I think
Yeah.
one of the
Really
important
nice.
things that has struck me is that in a world where we continuously complain about the young don't read enough, should our efforts not be induced into getting them to read? And some of us who believe in the value of traditional literature or literature as we all know it, or on the other hand, are we adapting to the SMS language world that we have got into, and as a result are crunching great literature into the kind of stuff I showed you, which is not, in my view, not at all a derogatory comment. It takes a lot of skill and creative skill to even write this. But it remains an issue in my head as what is a healthy balance? Are we pushing? And you know, the three ventures that I spoke of, nanofiction, amazing stuff. I mean, particularly if you come from a creative advertising background, I mean, I look at every third one and I say, I wish I had written it. But at the same time, there is this thing of saying to my son or fortunately, the next generation, my granddaughter reads a lot. But I've always struggled with trying to get my son to read. And he used to always say, no, I'll watch audiovisual medium. Through cartoons, I will learn. I won't read. So are we, in fact, giving them an escape way out by promoting this kind of nanofiction or macrofiction, which of course takes a huge amount of effort and creativity to do, but have we sort of created another monster? I don't know.
No, I think people either read or they don't read. I don't. Sometimes it is because of whatever their parents or their older siblings have, inculcated. Sometimes it's just inborn or genetic. How much ever you try to tell a child to read, unless they have that thing in them, they don't. And they get their creativity or forms of expression, like you said. Probably, I don't know if you're talking about Rudy. Obviously, in music, right?
Yeah,
so they have other avenues of expression and other places where they can get it. So that's what I've seen from all the children that I know of who either read or don't read. I remember when Sriram was very young, I used to get all manner of books for him to read. Heidi, from when he was small, because Heidi was one book when I read when I was a little girl. All those Noddies and and he never got started on any of that. And then eventually, when it came to his time, he picked up his own set of books, one of those dragon books he started off with.
Mm-hmm.
But now he can read pretty much anything he wants, provided he chooses to. So I think it is inherent. And I don't think that if we create nanofiction, that it's going to take them away from classics. At different phases of life, you pick certain kinds of book. I found
because
that
some of these sites have huge following. I mean, you should see the kind of
Insta poetry and this especially on Instagram. There's it's huge. And I mean, it's basically spreading ideas, giving ideas, provoking
initially
thought.
they began by having a team of 15 writers and they were creating their own work. But the moment they opened it up to user-generated content, the kind of user-generators, which means that the internet, as it has done in many other fields, democratizes talent, as it were. So people who thought they could not write now feel that they can write. So everybody wants to be a writer, everybody wants to be a singer, everybody wants to be a poet. And therefore, that has led to huge participation in ventures.
Yeah, that's good. The point I was making is, even though we have the Insta media and the social media and the nano literature, the ones who want to go back and read Iliad and Odyssey will.
There is no danger. Basically, you're saying that
so.
will remain, that will survive. But these greater, newer opportunities are actually wonderful creative expressions of what you can do.
Yeah, it expands your horizon. It is not going to take away from a serious reader. And not having this is not going to push them into classics. They will either read the nano fiction or they might watch TV. But because it is there, they were not going to read Homer anyways.
Good, I feel better because
I think it also caters to an audience where the attention span is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, right? For example, with children's cartoons,
they don't spend too much time with reading.
But probably people who read may end up writing these micro and nano things better. Yeah. In fact, if you're more sort of word wise, you'll probably be able to use it and create better
and like you
work.
said, it is very difficult. Editing content is the most difficult thing for a writer, to compress.
Absolutely.
What you want to say.
So every creative director used to tell me that, "Chala, main feature film acha bana lunga. You don't make me write these 30-second film commercials. It's so tough to say the whole story in 30 seconds."
So I think I I welcome the move of this nano culture, because they always say in English that brevity is the soul of wit. And the more precise you are, the sharper you are, it's a more keen intelligence. And I wish that some of our honorable judges were to read it, because I was reading yesterday. In UK, no judgment is more than 50 pages. Here, on average, it is 500 pages, leading up to 1,000 pages.
I've often wondered what they fill it with.
So,
Childhood
it's
stories.
impossible. I don't know, the litigant at the end of it all will die reading the judgment. I mean, get any.
No, see, it is. I think the intent is to always make us depend on lawyers. They make the language so convoluted that only they can understand. The lay people should not understand, and they should not lose their livelihood. That's the only.
So the British gave it to us and went back to 50 pages.
I know. Like they did with the railways, they kept the narrower gauge to themselves.
Like they kept the 377 and the sedition laws. A lot of hangovers that we haven't gotten over.
Okay.
Are we going?
Any other comments?
Are we even going to see Valentine Lobo? Even I would like to see who the.
No,
you don't have
no,
any
I don't.
camera
No, I'm
in your
not in the
then?
house. I'm in my office actually, and that's why it's on the network.
There you go. Saturday 8:45.
I had an
in the
ICU call.
office.
I had an
My
ICU
God.
call, so I finished with that and came down. But
Okay.
yeah, fascinating.
All right. Great having you
also,
here.
I mean, even when I try to do scientific writing for a paper, the discussion where you have to put your findings, your ideas, and what others have said on the topic into 3 paragraphs or so, and put it is what I find the most difficult. And it's an art.
Those fuddy-duddy reviewers will sit and ask you to give explanations on this, that, everything else, and then say 1,500 words.
Exactly.
So frustrating.
Yeah. So this could be one way for which we could learn, by which we could learn to do that, by writing microfiction. Thank you, Shibu. It was fascinating being here.
Thank you, Prasad.
Thank you.
Lovely
Thank you, everybody.
Stories. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks, Valentine.
Okay. Bye.
Good
Good night. Bye.